I'd invite you to think when you hear this gospel or the beginning of this gospel, what is almost the first thing that you think? I bet if it's not the first thing, it's probably the second thing, and it's doubting Thomas. Right? We think of this gospel, and the poor guy, Thomas, who lived his life and died for the faith as a martyr, gets this name, Doubting Thomas. I think we start there with this passage from John, but I think if we stay there, we miss the focus and the point of this gospel, and perhaps even something far more odd. What does Jesus say? He says, "Peace be with you," when he enters the room. And this is where the odd part comes in. And then he just shows him his wounds. Have you ever noticed that's kind of a strange thing to do? Maybe that's what high school boys do, but not necessarily, the Savior of the world. But he said, look at this, the way that Jesus does this. He says, "Peace be with you." He shows them his wounds, and then again it says, "Peace be with you." He's teaching us something there. He's saying to us that by these wounds, you have been saved. That by these wounds, you will be healed. That by these wounds, you will know peace. We don't often associate peace and wounds, but I think if we think on this Divine Mercy Sunday of the image of Divine Mercy, I don't know if you've ever seen it, it's of Jesus. He's wearing a white robe, and there's these kind of laser rays coming out, right, of red and of blue, which symbolizes his blood and the water that came forth, that rushed forth from him. But where do they come from? If you can see that image in your mind, where do they come from? But from his heart that was pierced and wounded. The Lord is saying to us that if you know my wounds and perhaps know your own, you will know peace. And it's perhaps the most paradoxical thing that we will experience. Yesterday, we had 2 young men in Holy Cross ordained priests, and the bishop, Bishop Pat Neary now, who was one of ours, said to them something that also sounds so strange. What makes these men worthy to be ordained to this priesthood is not their strengths, it's not their gifts, but their weakness. And why? Because, as Paul says, it is when we are weak that we are strong. He says, "I boast in my afflictions because that is when I know that Christ is alive in me, that I can't do this alone." It's in our weaknesses that we turn to God and perhaps offer all kinds of prayers. But it's only in our weakness, or primarily in our weakness, that we're humble enough to realize that I don't have it all figured out. That I can't do it all. And so I invite you, my brothers and sisters, I invite us on this Divine Mercy Sunday to think of our weakness, and rather than hide them, rather than stuff them down, today the Lord invites us to bring them to him, to offer him our wounds, so that we might know mercy. And we see that in a particular way in Thomas, who I imagine was probably really embarrassed when Jesus comes through the locked door a week later and says to him, "Thomas, put your finger in my side." And when I can't help, though, but think of the Caravaggio, Can you guys, if you don't know it, go back home and type in Doubting Thomas Caravaggio or Wounds of Christ Caravaggio. But if you do know the image, I'll explain it for a second. It's Christ with no shirt on. It's Thomas who's kind of looking in there, and Christ is forcing his hand in the wound in his side in such a way that it opens up again. And Thomas is crowded around by other people. So I think there's something instructive for us here too. First, that Christ calls us to enter into his wounds so that he might enter into ours and bring peace. But also that our seeking and searching for mercy and peace is not an independent event. We need others around us to rally us towards Christ. We have people sitting up here who very clearly witness to that. That where would you be, my beloved neophytes, without your sponsors and godparents? Right? We do this together. That's why we come here, because we must be nourished and do this together as disciples of Christ. There is no Christian on an island. We come here together to know mercy. But this image of Caravaggio also reminds us that mercy is deeply immersive, deeply intimate. We need to get in there. We need to allow some of the messiness and not be afraid of it, but allow it so that then we might know healing, and our healing might bring us peace that we can share with one another. I'd like to say that one of the greatest things we can do as Christians is to allow our wounds, having been healed, to be balm and salve for others who have similar wounds. We see this in many who have experienced injustice, loss, grief, who stand by the side of another going through something very much the same. By our wounds, the Lord offers us peace. But it's not just for us. It must be shared. So I invite you, my brothers and sisters, today on this Divine Mercy Sunday, to allow the Lord into your locked rooms and allow him to say, "Peace be with you." Bring your wounds and your weakness to this altar, that they, like the host, might be blessed, broken, and transformed. Say to the Lord on this Divine Mercy Sunday, "Jesus, I trust in you." And I promise you, my brothers and sisters, if you continue to do this, to allow your wounds to be sources of peace by bringing to them to the Lord, you will know new life and have a foretaste of salvation. The Lord offers us peace. He offers us to accept our wounds and to offer them back to him. In his wounds and in his will is our peace. And I think even doubting Thomas would say there's no doubt about that. So I say to you, my wounded disciples of Christ, my brothers and sisters, I say to you the words of Christ wounded.